we're here to talk about market failure. Now, before we talk about market failure, I want to talk about a short story that a friend of mine once told me about a father and two sons. Now, these two sons were usually pretty good at sharing things, except in the case of carrot cake. That was their one weakness. Whenever they got carrot cake, one brother would cut the cake and then he would obviously choose the biggest piece for himself. Now, the father didn't want to do everything himself. He wanted them to figure it out. So he decided to step in and give the oldest brother the job of cutting the cake, and then gave the younger brother the job of distributing the pieces. So the older brother made sure that he cut the pieces as fairly as possible. Now, when we talk about market failure, that story is relevant not necessarily because of the father's solution, but because the market, just like the boys, is usually pretty good at efficiently distributing society's resources, except in cases like the carrot cake, where the market's allocation isn't exactly in society's best interests. This leads to something called market failure. So what exactly is market failure? Well, we can think of it as an inefficient allocation of resources, where supply doesn't exactly equal demand. So in these cases, products are over or underconsumed. Well, what exactly do we mean by something that's over or underconsumed? Well, basically, the government thinks that we should be using the products more or less depending on if they're good or bad for us. Right? There are some important terms that we need to know if we're going to understand the idea of market failure. First is the idea of a merit good. Well, a merit good is a private good whose benefits are not fully known to us when we manufacture the product, or even if we do know the societal benefits of this product, it's not really the point, right? That's not why the product is made. Also, there's this belief that the product should be distributed based on need instead of the ability to pay. Now, usually it's because these products are too important to just exclude people that can't afford it. Classic examples of merit goods are like education, healthcare. These are things that are too important to just exclude the poor from, right? A term that goes hand in hand with the idea of a merit good is a positive externality. Now, positive externalities are positive benefits or perks that affect or help third parties. So people that didn't even buy or consume the product get the benefit. Now, whenever I think of these positive benefits to third parties, I always think of the idea of a professional sports stadium. So I always wondered, why would a city pay community or public funds to try to help a private sports team like a football team or a baseball team build a stadium in the city? I mean, it obviously benefits the people who love the sport. You get to see your favorite football or baseball team. But it also benefits the non-fans. It increases city revenues. It increases, television exposure for the city. Now, unfortunately, the people who get the benefits without paying for them, they're called free riders. Now, the reason I say unfortunately is because this is why the market failure happens. Because these people are reaping the benefits without consuming the product. Now, if a government wants to solve this, then they have to try to increase that consumption. Now, if you want to visualize this, we're going to go back to our old supply and demand curve, except this time we're going to call supply the marginal private cost and demand the marginal private benefit. Now, these are the incremental cost and benefit associated with the consumption of each additional unit of a good or service. Now, when we're looking at things like vaccines, we have to consider more than just the private benefits. We have to look at the overall social benefit that comes with each a vaccine. Now, when someone gets vaccinated, it obviously benefits the person that gets vaccinated, but it also has an overall social benefit, right? We call this marginal social benefit, right? And you'll see that it's actually higher, right? Now, this leads to a dead weight loss. Now, what is a dead weight loss? Well, it's the loss of welfare, right? The product is underconsumed. We're not consuming as much as we should. Enough people are not getting vaccinated. Why? Well, because, a variety of reasons, right? Our job is to try to increase the consumption. Well, our job as the government. So if we are the government, how do we fix it? Well, we can give grants and subsidies to the producers. This would lower the cost to produce the product, making it cheaper to produce, and that would usually encourage supply. Or we could give grants and subsidies to the consumers. This would lower the cost of the product, make it easier to buy. If the product is easier to buy, it should increase demand. Or we could use our money on educational campaigns. Now, we could educate people to try to decrease what we call information loss. Now, information loss is the general idea that these free riders are not consuming the products, not because they don't want to or because they're selfish necessarily, but because they just don't know that of all the social benefits that could come from the consumption of this product. So if we decrease this information loss, it should increase the use of the product. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have demerit goods. Now, demerit goods are the opposite. They're private goods that have a cost that is not known when you first manufacture the product. Now, classical examples of this demerit good are, fast food, right? People don't make fast food to try to make people fat. That's just an additional cost to society that comes, from the consumption of fast food. Now, going hand in hand with with the idea of demerit goods is the idea of negative externalities. Now, these negative externalities, just like positive externalities, they're negative impacts that they impact third parties. People that didn't even consume the fast food are being affected. A perfect example of negative impacts are the idea of cigarettes. This is what I think of whenever I talk about the idea of negative externalities. Cigarettes and the idea of secondhand smoke. Right? If I smoke a cigarette, it costs me the price of the cigarette, the price of the pack of cigarettes, but it costs also my family and society. Anyone who is near me when I'm smoking it is affected. They get sick because of secondhand smoke, even if they don't smoke themselves. So if we want to visualize this, we're going back to our marginal private cost and our marginal private benefit, except now we have to consider the cost, the overall cost to society, right? We call that line the marginal social costs. So if we're talking about cigarettes, if I buy a cigarette, then it affects society's health as a whole, not just mine. So again, this creates a deadweight loss. The product is overconsumed. So government's job is to try to decrease that consumption. So how do we fix this? How do we decrease that consumption? Well, we could levy taxes and use legislation with the stated goal of making the product more expensive. If you make the product more expensive, the logic is people won't buy it as much. Now, we always hear the idea of a sin tax or the idea of levying a tax on undesirable products like alcohol or cigarettes. If you make it more expensive, maybe I'll try to quit smoking. Or you could use legislation to just ban the product outright, right? Or lastly, we could spend money on trying to decrease that information loss that we talked about again. This time, discouraging use from the product by talking about all the social damage that it can do. Right? Also, another term that is really important is the idea of a public good. Now, public good is a product that we feel is so important that we offer it for free, right? Like the idea of a road. Well, how does this lead to market failure? Well, there's no incentive to take care of the product, right? Usually, the consumption of a product is limited. The demand of a product is limited by its cost. But if there's no cost, then give me as many as I can carry, Lastly, we're going to talk about the idea of monopolies. So how do monopolies lead to market failure? Well, they lead to artificial increase of prices, right? These decrease access to the product which usually affects the poor more than anyone else. So because people who want it can't afford it, the product is underconsumed. So how do we fix that? Well, usually the government fixes it through regulation, antitrust legislation, trying to block mergers. This increases competition and brings about efficient allocation of resources. Well, that's all I have for market failure today. I hope you learned a little something. Make sure to come back and learn more about economics whenever you can, right? It's worth it, believe me, all right? Have a good one.